All right, let's try this again. I actually recorded this video like 2 minutes ago, but I don't know how to click the right button, so I'm going to try it again. Let's talk a little bit about the Gilded Age. That was one of the requests. One of the interesting things I have seen is a lot of these requests tend to be somewhat mixed with one another. I put a video out on the industrial age, industrialization of the United States yesterday. This is very much tied in with the Gilded Age. The next video I'm going to do is going to be on progressive, and this is also kind of tied in with the Gilded Age. The end of the Industrial Revolution in the United States really is kind of the beginning of the Gilded Age. They really kind of go together. As all those industries are being formed, like railroads and oil and steel, that really leads to this very prosperous era. And these, what's known as robber barons, that were really, really wealthy, the John Rockefellers and Andrew Carnegies, they were really, really big and really, really wealthy. So the Industrial Revolution is really kind of marked by innovation. There is a lot of patents that were given out by the U.S. government, more than at any period in the United States, and things like the telephone and the telegraph. We're starting to be able to light up the United States with electronic lights, so we can work in factories longer. We can also stay up past 7 o'clock at night. We can do more things. So innovation is really big in the United States, and really, because of the innovation, these robber barons are able to get more and more and more wealthy. Railroads is kind of the key of all of this because of a couple factors. The first one, obviously, is the ability to move massive or much larger chunks of product much farther distances. So instead of just, if I have a business and I have to rely on my hometown to do whatever it is I want to do, now all of a sudden I can have customers that are, in a different state or maybe even across the country. And it's worthwhile to them to order from me, because before, instead, I would have to ship it on by horseback, and I could only have a wagon full. Now I can, fill that car up with or multiple railroad cars full of product, and I can get them out to you a lot quicker and a bigger quantity, so you can sell those products off. The industrial area also was big for increasing factories, so we could produce things faster because we can ship big quantities out to places. So because I can ship more and I can sell them to various spots in the United States, I can make more. So that was a big deal. The other kind of big part of this, and reasons that people were able to make more money, railroads created other industries. Based on the railroads thriving, other industries were able to thrive off of that, and also tied in with innovation for their industry. For example, railroads needed oil to run, oil and gas. So guys like John Rockefeller made a lot of money through his oil refineries. Railroads needed massive amounts of iron or steel. They used iron in the early days. Iron wasn't nearly as strong, kind of expensive. Through innovation, we found a process that could make steel a lot quicker, a lot cheaper, the Bessemer process. It was easier to make, cheaper to make, and steel is stronger than iron. So railroads preferred to use steel because it lasted longer. They didn't have to replace the railroad ties nearly as often. They really didn't have to, steel would last for long stretches of time. So the railroads kind of made the steel industry kind of a big booming industry throughout the United States. As this transportation industry kind of expanded, that created other additional needs for steel with, bridges, and we'll talk about skyscrapers in a minute. The reason all these industries were able to kind of expand like they were, not only was that innovation, it also was investment from investors. There was money, there was a lot of money floating around, a lot of government help during those times. They provided very favorable laws for cheap labor, particularly immigrants. They had pretty lax immigration laws, so a lot of times immigrants would come over and they knew there was opportunity in the factories, and they absolutely would go work in those factories for very, very low wages. So there was a pretty big supply of cheap labor for factories. Even So much so that there were like these agencies that would go to European countries and they would advertise, hey, would you like some opportunity? There's opportunity in America, lots of jobs. They would paint this very rosy picture of what it's like to live in the factories in the big cities. And all these people would come over from Italy and Ireland and France and wherever else, Germany. And when they got there and they worked in the factories, they'd realize this isn't quite what we expected. Um, and then the contractors would go over and they would get another wave of new prospective employees through immigrants. And those contractors would save a portion of they'd get a sliver of the immigrants' wages for recruiting them over here for a time being. A lot of struggling farmers also came to the city for opportunities, for jobs. They also came for excitement. This new wave of immigrants and struggling farmers and young people looking for opportunities, they also were looking for excitement. And the city life provided that. There was more entertainment, there was more like music, and at some point professional sports became a thing. So there were plays, and then there were obviously other vices that it seems like popped up every day in class that we talked about. Things like alcohol and gambling and prostitution. So if that was your thing, like the cities had a large amount of those things to offer you if that was your vice, I guess. Cities were unprepared for the growth. We kind of talked about this before. This was not a great time to live in cities. If you remember the project we did on your tenement, where you had to list the tenement like you were selling it. So you had to pretend like you're a real estate agent to sell your tenement. Those were not desirable places to live. You had very low wages wherever you worked, and what you could afford wasn't really enough to house your family. You had very small spaces, and you may be living with, your wife and 4 or 5 kids, and maybe you had cousins and aunts and uncles and grandparents and who else living with you. So sometimes you had to really kind of nestle together in a very small space. The city was unprepared not only to meet the demands of the housing as far as just the room, but also just the services it provided. The sewage system is probably the best example. During this time, like I said, there was just this influx of people, and the sewage couldn't contain, for lack of a better term, all of these people kind of using the sewers. That's why you saw a lot of human waste in the streets, and it was not really the greatest time for sanitation in the United States. That led to some disease and some other things kind of going around the city, so not ideal. Obviously, with these conditions, we see that there is a gigantic concentration of wealth. The guys like J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, John Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt would be a great example. All these guys that were head of these big industries and their managers, people that worked under the vice presidents and those management positions, they made a lot of money and they made good money. And there was a middle class that made money, but there was a really big concentration of wealth where a lot of the wealth was in the hands of a very few amount of people. And there was a good percentage of people that worked in the factories that just did not have a whole lot. Like we talked about, bad living conditions and, low pay for sure. Now, those people, those John Rockefellers and Andrew Carnegies, they were ruthless in their business practices. Whether it was firing, reducing workers' wages when things got tight to maximize profits, all of those things they did. Those things were not illegal, but they might not have been the greatest way to treat your workers. They often use shady practices. I know John Rockefeller was pretty notorious for putting companies in other people's names. So maybe he would have like a cleaning lady or a guy that swept the floors. One of his oil refineries might be in one of those people's names. So on the surface, it didn't look like he controlled as much as he did. But when you dug a little deeper, you'd realize that John Rockefeller ran, like I said, 90+% of all oil refineries in the U.S. were owned by him. Muckrakers, who were journalists that kind of dug into this, started reporting those kinds of stories, and it didn't really set well with a lot of Americans. Again, this wasn't illegal back in those days, but it looked a little shifty. Obviously, like John Rockefeller knew it looked shifty because he did it because he didn't want to appear like he owned it all. So he knew it looked kind of bad and did it anyways. Trust busting kind of became a thing. The United States government passed laws like the Sherman Antitrust Act that gave them some tools to bust up some of these big trusts, some of these big monopolies. Now, they didn't really utilize those tools in the late 1800s during the Gilded Age, but they gave the tools, and the U.S. Congress also passed other legislation that further kind of gave the Sherman Antitrust Act a little bit of teeth. So future presidents like Teddy Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, yes, Grant, the same William Howard Taft that got stuck in the bathtub, gave them the tools to bust some trusts up. And eventually John Rockefeller's companies would get busted up and sold off. Ironically enough, John Rockefeller made actually more money when that happened than he did when he controlled it, but that's a story for a different day. The muckrakers also had a lot of stories about how bad like conditions were for workers. Jacob Riis was an author that wrote a book called How the Other Half Lived that talked about how bad it was in the United States for a lot of these workers, and a lot of people in the middle class didn't realize that there was all these people struggling in the cities, that conditions were quite so bad. So this kind of enlightened some of Americans about how the other half did really live. This is the beginning of the progressive era, and this is another video that I'm going to make that was requested. And this is kind of the beginning of that. Like, so we see kind of industrialization leads to the Gilded Age. That kind of leads to some progressive movement. When people realized how bad it was for other individuals, they pushed for some changes and some reforms. Big cities had what's called settlement houses, where they provided maybe like meals or a place to sleep if you didn't have a place to sleep. Some training for immigrants, how to become like Americanized, so how to assimilate into American culture. They would teach them classes and skills. The Hull House in Chicago was probably the best example. The most famous of the settlement houses, ran by a lady by the name of Jane Addams. Settlement houses were kind of a big deal. Labor unions also kind of sprung up big during the late part of the 1800s, during the Gilded Age, because workers did feel victimized. There was a rise in the number of people belonging to labor unions. There was also a rise in labor union conflicts. So there was conflicts with management. Oftentimes, if there was a conflict, people tended to side with big companies. The courts tended to side with big companies. So even though violence wasn't always the labor union's fault, I mean, sometimes it was, but oftentimes they would get blamed for it. If you joined a union or if you participated in a strike, a lot of times you were blacklisted, so your name was put on a list where other employees knew that you were kind of bad news or you were not somebody that they should mess with and hire. So sometimes you were kind of branded that way. But labor unions did gain victories for working class people. We'll talk about that in the next video, progressivism. So this is a little bit of a background on the Gilded Age. Again, a lot of money was made for a lot of people. There was a concentration of wealth to some extent. And it does kind of butt up against the industrial age and the progressive, right in between, kind of nestled right in there. So right in the late 1890s, the Gilded Age kind of comes to an end and the progressive era kind of begins. So if you have any questions on this, please let me know. If you have ideas for other videos, please let me know, and I'll be more than happy to turn those out. Until that, I will see you next time.